Folks, I'm going to give you 2 more minutes to sort of close it up. Let's close it up here for 2 minutes. Hey, let's bring it in. Everybody can turn around and sit comfortably again. However, we're going to have another discussion session at the end, so don't get too comfortable. And I'm fully cognizant of the fact that whenever I speak, nobody gets too comfortable, so I'm aware of that. Those of you that came in and got a little envelope, raise your envelopes, okay? I have often said that if I were ever on death row, and by the way, I don't plan on getting there, and it's not because I'm a good hider of stuff I do. I'm just not going to do anything that gets me there, right? That's my plan anyway. My last meal, what would your last meal be? My last meal would be a Whataburger number 5 all the way with jalapenos, okay? Honestly, that's what it would be. And so all of you that got a little card are getting a little Whataburger card today. Please don't treat it as your last meal, but y'all, rather than me walking down there, somebody come up here and grab these. There you go. Let's hand those out, Ken. Raise your cards. And look, the little deal says on it, we're going to have to forgive Ken for that very poor joke. We don't get too excited. The little card says $15 to $100. It's 15, okay? Don't get too excited. And I'm not even sure that would buy a number 5 all the way with jalapenos now, the way things have gone. Well, let's move on. We're talking about Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. We're going to read it first, and then we're going to talk about how that applies to the concept of forgiveness. This is Matthew chapter 18, and Jesus has been instructing the disciples on what to do with a bothersome brother who is wronging them. If he wrongs you, then you're supposed to go to him personally, and then you're supposed to, if he doesn't correct himself, he's supposed to take it to the church, and then there are some circumstances under which you remove them from the fellowship. So that's the subject. And Peter then comes up and says to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. And some of your translations say 70 times 7. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. I put that in yellow for a reason. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when the same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. That's also in yellow. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, They were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debts. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Now this is a famous parable. Everyone in the room has heard it before, at least heard the story given. And it's often misinterpreted and often misanalyzed to talk about what is necessary to be saved, or, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about what it really means. Let's look at the context of it. We've already discussed this earlier in Matthew 18. Jesus is discussing how to handle a situation in which a brother sins, right? And he instructs his followers to take it to him directly, and then if that doesn't work, bring another brother in. If that doesn't work, there's circumstances in which you should separate your fellowship with that person. And so Jesus gets this question from Peter. And the question is, how many times should I forgive my brother? That's the question Peter asks. And actually, Jewish law had been interpreted on this very point. In the book of Amos, chapter 1, and in chapter 3, there are several references to the fact that God has forgiven a certain people 3 times. And so the Jewish rabbis and leaders of the day, and particularly the Pharisees, who would have been listening in on this discussion that Jesus was having, they had interpreted to mean that you are to forgive 3 times. Because if God forgives 3 times, and the 4th time he pronounces judgment, as he did in Amos, then man shouldn't have any other standard than that. So we should forgive 3 times. Now let's leave aside the difficulty of forgiving 3 times. Most of us aren't even capable of doing that, right? But let's just assume that was the reference that was being made. And so it's important to understand when Peter asks this question, he is going to make a suggestion that he believes makes him a very forgiving and generous spirit. Okay? That's the context in which Peter asks the question. Now look, Peter's a follower. Peter is he's the top guy, right? He's the rock upon which the church will be built, and, those sorts of things. And so he's kind of a leader among the group and one of the confidants of Jesus. And he's going to go the extra mile and forgive 7 times. And Jesus' answer here is very shocking to the group. He doesn't say, "No, you should forgive 7 times. That's great of you, Peter. What a great suggestion." What does he say? He says 77 times. And some of your translations, as we discussed, say 70 times 7, which is 490. But I don't think the number is really the point here. Okay, I think we can agree on that. This is not a parable about sin. There are plenty of those. This is not a parable about salvation. This is a parable about forgiveness, how we are supposed to forgive. Let's move on. So let's have a little more context about the story. This is a king, right? He wishes to settle accounts with his servants. So he's the head of the government. He's the top guy. And he's got a lot of assets and a lot of things going on in his kingdom, and he has a number of servants. And so this guy shows up, and he owes 10,000 talents. This is how we know this guy was a government worker. He has somehow lost 10,000 talents with no accountability until the last minute, okay? And I say this as a former government employee, all right? I used to carry the mail in the Postal Service, so neither rain nor snow nor dark of night shall stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. I was told to learn that when I started working for the Postal Service in the 1970s. Now the motto is, it'll get there when it gets there. 10,000 talents. A talent was a unit of weight. It was about 36 kilograms, about 80 pounds. And so a talent of money was 80 pounds of silver. Yesterday, I looked up what the exchange rate was for silver. And depending on what site you look on, it's somewhere between $28.85 an ounce all the way up to $29.08 an ounce, somewhere in there. So if you just took $29 as a deal there, you're talking about 80 pounds of silver. One talent would be, the 10,000 talents we're talking about here would be $392 million. This guy had frittered away or lost or stolen or whatever $392 million. This is why I say he's a government guy, right? He has no idea what he did with it. $392 million. Now, one thing, we may not agree on everything I say today, but one thing I think we can agree on, that's a lot of money. All right. Now, a denarius, it's important to remember in this story, a denarius is also part of the deal. A denarius was a day's wage, and it wasn't much. Today, it was like $1 a day, maybe, or something like that. A denarius was not much. One talent, and it depends on what source you look at, and it's a little unclear because we are talking about something, thousands of years ago. A talent ranged between 3,000 to 6,000 denarii. But let's just say it was 3,000 denarii to a talent. One talent would be, 10 years of wages? With all the festivals that the Jews had, you had 300 working days a year. That's 3,000 talents is a year's wages. 10,000 talents, 10 years of wages times 10,000, 100,000 years of an average wage. Once again, we can agree that is a lot of money that this servant is accountable for. This is a picture by Rembrandt. Most of you know Rembrandt was Dutch. He lived in the 1600s. The name of this is The Parable of the Unforgiving Servant. And you'll see that he's got the king there, and he's facing a guy bowing. And the guy who's bowing is well-dressed and well-appointed. He's got the turban and all of that on. I can 100% guarantee, since this was a parable and it wasn't really a real event anyway, we know it didn't happen. But if it would have happened in Jesus' day, none of them would have looked like this. But anyway, that's the way Rembrandt did it. So let's make some observations. The first is, Peter's question is predicated on a certainty. Can we all agree on that? At some point, his brother will sin against him. And he's not just talking about Andrew. He's talking about other believers, right? At some point in your life, someone will wrong you. That will happen. He doesn't ask if my brother sins. He asks when my brother sins. So that's one thing. Let's remember that. You cannot get through life without being wronged. So we start with that. It's a certainty. The second is, the question is not about sin. He doesn't say, how do I correct this sin? What he says is, how do I forgive him? How many times? It's not about enabling sin. You sometimes when you have these conversations, you say, well, I've got a friend of mine who, he keep wanting to borrow money because he's a drug addict or something. Well, you don't want to enable sin. You don't want to enable something dangerous or damaging to someone else's life. Forgiveness does not mean you have to agree with whatever they're asking or whatever they're doing, right? Doesn't mean that. So it's not about that. It's not about sin or enabling sin or anything like that. It's about forgiveness. How do we forgive? Okay? Jesus gives a number. The number is 77 times. Some of you are accountants. You'd actually start marking them down, right? But that's not the point. We can all agree the point is not the number. I mean, that's not the point of it. We are to practice a radical form of forgiveness. And it's to be part of our nature and part of our response. And then there are more observations here. The king does not just decide against punishment. He didn't just say, okay, I decided, you know what, I won't sell you and your family into slavery. Probably couldn't raise $392 million anyway. You're not worth that much, right? He says, no, he doesn't say that. He says, and then you can just pay me out whenever, just pay on it, $20 a week or whatever. No. He completely forgives the debt. So the guy doesn't owe the money anymore. Think about that. He actually pays the price himself for the servant's debt. And the servant in this story does not react in the same manner, okay? Not only does he demand the 100 denarii, and by the way, that's a fairly sizable amount of money as well. I mean, that's 3 months' wages. I mean, that's not nothing, right? But he doesn't, I mean, this doesn't even compare to what he's been forgiven. And so instead he chokes the debtor and has him tossed in prison. He doesn't even work out a payment plan, right? Instead, he goes straight to the maximum penalty. And this is a painting done by Domenico Feti in 1620. Feti was Italian. He died at the age of 26. And, or maybe, no, 34, I'm sorry, 34. And this was a very popular subject in the 1600s, by the way. A lot of these Baroque and Renaissance painters painted this particular parable. And I've been asked the question before, why do all these artists paint all these religious scenes, in Europe? And the answer is because the patron was the church. The church would pay them for these paintings, which they would hang on the wall or on the, frescoes and things like that. You can see the guy choking a man there down at the bottom of that picture. So there are 5 lessons that I hope we can gain from this story. The first is, and we've talked about this, you will be sinned against in this life. That will happen. If you have any interaction at all with other people, someone will let you down or wrong you. It is absolutely guaranteed to occur. There is no escape. And so your reaction to that situation needs to be directed by the instructions that Jesus gave to his disciples. We talked about this last week. The pastor talked about this last week in the sermon. What would Jesus do? So Jesus is telling you what he would do, okay? We need to be guided by that, not by what feels right to you at the time. The second lesson is we cannot repay our own debt of sin. Our debt cannot be repaid, okay? He racked up an impossible amount of debt. That's impossible. He would not ever be in a position to pay it. He was destined for a substantial penalty and a life of misery, both in this life and the hereafter, right? He was destined for misery until he was forgiven. All of us have an impossible amount of debt, the debt of sin. We cannot pay it. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. We are incapable of repaying it. As a result, we are destined for a substantial penalty as well. Separation from God and a lifetime, both here and in the hereafter, of misery until we are forgiven. This one's Claude Vignon. This is the guy who lived to be 26. He was French. I love this particular painting because that's a French king, isn't it? Look at that guy. And the ladies dressed with their feathers in their hair. I mean, obviously, the dress in the Middle East was nothing like this. These guys are painting things they had no reference to or idea of, had never been there, didn't know what it looked like at all. But this guy, he's got money on the table, and I will say the servant looks a little bit distressed in that one. And I just kind of like the way that one looks. The third lesson we can learn is that God offers forgiveness of our debt of sin, all right? We can't pay it, so he does by the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And this is significant because we don't deserve forgiveness. One of the questions we talked about earlier was, if you don't apologize, I'm not going to have anything to do with you, right? So we oftentimes require people to earn our forgiveness by some action or change of mind. And look, maybe they do need to change their mind. Maybe that's exactly the thing they should do, right? But we see here that Jesus is not tying that to forgiveness, okay? We committed the sin, we deserve death, but God decides on life for us instead. Just like this king did in this story. God gives us grace, what we need. He does not give us justice, what we deserve. We get grace instead. The fourth lesson is we can forgive because we are forgiven. God's forgiveness sets us free, not just from eternal separation from God, but freedom to forgive others as well. We'll talk about this again in just a moment, but the ability to forgive is good for the soul. You don't turn into a bitter, vindictive person. We all know people like that. Many times they're in our own families, right? Bitter, vindictive person. If you don't know a bitter, vindictive person, if you don't know them and your friends do, then something's up. The forgiveness we received was undeserved. We didn't earn it, okay? We shouldn't just forgive those that deserve it. Forgiveness is, by its nature, is intended to be extended to people who are in the wrong. I realize sometimes people demand forgiveness when you didn't do anything wrong. I mean, sometimes I agree that happens, but look, we're not talking about that. We're talking about somebody who did something wrong. Well, if you're going to make them be perfect before you forgive them, then guess what? That'll never happen. You become bitter. You become, disturbing in your demeanor and attitude toward other people. There's a cycle of resentment, right, to get even. And that really has caused suffering and brokenness throughout history. That's not a good attitude. That's not a good demeanor to have. In our own circle of life, the only way out of that is true forgiveness. That's the only way out of it. This is a famous quote from St. Augustine. Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. We all know people that are full of resentment, and they're not pleasant to be around, even if it's not directed to you. Be careful about that. And then another lesson we learn is that if God loves us, even though we have wronged him, we should love those around us, even though they have wronged us. I mean, the base premise of this discussion today is that somebody did wrong us. It's not a question of whether or not it happened or whether or not it was intentional or any of the rest of it. They wronged us, and they did it intentionally, and, gosh, they're sorry people because they did it, right? That's the premise of the whole discussion. Do you forgive somebody like that? That's an expectation for the followers of Jesus, that we do that. That's what it is. Don't hold a grudge. You were wronged. It doesn't seem fair, but let's just be honest. The scriptures don't teach us that fairness is the standard. What they teach us is that love is the standard. And love covers a multitude of ills, or in some scriptural translations, love covers a multitude of sins. Try applying that, and you will be forgiving people if you do. Your love for God is shown by how you forgive those around you. Think about that. Your demonstration of forgiveness is a demonstration of love for God. It's not, the person that you forgive might feel like they've been let off the hook and they may feel great about it, but it really isn't about them. It's more about your relationship to God, isn't it? That's a demonstration of love for God if you do that. It shows that we should extend to others the forgiveness that we receive from God. Practicing forgiveness helps us to break the cycle of resentment and anger that is a trap for so many people. This is Willem Droost, who was also a Dutch painter, and once again, 1655. I mean, this was the big subject in the 1600s. And once again, he's got the king with the turban, and the servant looks too young to have managed to come up with $392 million somehow. But anyway, there he is. So let's think about this. How do you want God to forgive you? Let's just talk about your own forgiveness, what you need. Do you want him to keep reminding you of the sin? Have you ever done that, by the way? I mean, we all do it, right? I'm not going to tell a story on my wife, but yesterday my wife asked me, she was going to the store. I'm not going to tell you the details because then you'll think I'm petty instead of her. And so anyway, she was going to the store, and she said, do you need anything? I said, yeah, you know what, I would like X. And so she goes to the store, and she comes back, and she brings back Y, not X. And I said, well, where's X? And she says, well, I thought you wanted Y. I clearly said X, right? You know, I reminded her of that this morning. Probably shouldn't have done that. I just read the lesson and I reminded her of that. Do you want to be reminded about all of your mess ups and all your sins and all your, you want that to happen all the time? You think there should be a written record? The truth is, there is a written record until it's erased by the blood of Christ. Do you want that written record kept on you? Do you want him to give you a fresh start? How much forgiveness do you want? How often? How about your worst sin? And I'm not asking for anybody to raise their hand and tell us what it was, but think this morning right now, what's the worst sin you ever committed in your life? I think we'd be shocked if we actually heard the answers, but you want God to forgive that one or not? You know, some people say sometimes, well, I can forgive this, but I can't forgive that. You've heard that phrase before, haven't you? Well, guess what? God forgave this, and he forgave that. He forgave everything. How many times? How many times do you want forgiveness? How often should we forgive others? We want God to forgive completely and give us a fresh start. That's the way we should forgive others. It's lucky for us that God is both just and merciful. He wants us to be just and merciful. If there's anybody in the world who should understand mercy, it's a Christian. And a Christian should be merciful to other people, even when they don't deserve it. Here are some scriptures that talk about that. We could spend the entire day talking about scriptures on this subject, and we don't have all day, so we won't. We'll just go over a few of them. Ephesians 4:32, be kind, forgiving of one another. Kindness and forgiveness are tied together. You cannot be an unforgiving person and be a kind person. You can't. Mark 11:25, whenever you pray, forgive so that you will be forgiven. Matthew 6:12, this is part of the Lord's Supper, the model prayer. The Lord's Prayer, the model prayer. Forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Colossians 3, forgive one another as God forgives you. Ecclesiastes 7:20, there is no one who does good and never sins. Psalm 102, he removes our sins as far as the east from the west. We are forgiven. We should be forgiving. Let's talk for a few minutes, and we're going to quit just a little bit early so we don't have quite as long to discuss this morning. We have, obviously, the service will be in here this morning, and so we need to make sure that people can come in and sit. So we're going to probably stop a few minutes early. How does a lack of forgiveness show up in our lives? What about this statement that we talked about earlier? How does that, I can forgive, but I can't forget. How does that attitude match up with what we learn in this parable? Does forgiving mean forgetting? What about the other statement? I can't forgive that person until they ask for forgiveness, and only if they really, really mean it. I'm guessing some of us in the room have said that before. I know I have. How might we act towards someone if we don't forgive them? Some of these are, I think when I was writing these down, I probably duplicated some of them a little bit. But anyway, how might we act towards someone if we don't forgive them? Does forgiving mean the wound is completely healed? Is there anyone you need to forgive? The second part is not as important. Does anyone need to forgive you? That may be true. We need to go to them and ask for forgiveness, and because that's good for you to do that. But if you're someone who needs to forgive someone else, don't wait. Start working on that now. Let's talk about those things for the next, say 10 minutes or so.